Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Red Lettuce. I'm here with Nick. Nick is with the Flame of Liberation. Nick, welcome to the show. It's your first time on. Please, before we begin, please introduce yourself and where can people find your work?
Yeah, thank you. Great to be with you. I love your guys' work, Red Lettuce. You have a lot of great videos, great content, and I really love the videos and work you guys do.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Flame of Liberation, you could find the Flame of Liberation on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And what the Flame of Liberation outlet does is mainly it promotes like revolutionary ideology from various socialist and communist movements and leaders from around the world, as well as addressing like certain like current day events and stuff and issues within the left. In recent months, there's been a lot of controversy over patriotic socialism. So Flame of Liberation has put out a good amount of information on that and sort of combating the synthetic left rhetoric around it and trying to clarify a lot of things about it.
Yeah, we do a lot of that too here in the Red Lettuce. We have like a Proletarian Patriotism stream. We haven't done one in a while, but yeah, we try to tackle that issue as much as we can as well. It's a very important issue facing us here at home, to really understand like what proletarian socialism means and why it's very useful in any revolutionary movement. But yeah, we're going to talk tonight about that for sure. We're going to talk about proletarian socialism, imperialism's impact on the American working class, and why the synthetic left are the foot soldiers for the imperialists. So why don't we start with proletarian socialism? Like let's talk about like what it is and why are the detractors wrong about it, aka the synthetic left. Because like whenever we seem to post about it or there's any kind of discussion, they want to shoot it down and they conflate it with nationalism, which is like a bourgeois ideology. So why don't we start there?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and it's interesting because everyone sort of has a slight variation of how they describe proletarian patriotism, patriotic socialism, American socialism. The way I go about it is I point out that what patriotic socialism, mainly the real essence of it is that socialism is to the benefit of the American people, the people in the United States. It would be to the benefit of the vast majority, the working class, the poor, who are the vast majority of the population. And it's extremely important to emphasize that. That might sound like something very basic, but it's extremely important to emphasize that point because of all of the anti-communist, anti-socialist propaganda from within that we're bombarded with all the time. On one hand, and on the other hand, sort of what a lot of the what we call the synthetic left and ultra left promote, and sort of the stereotype of leftism and socialism within the United States. There's this stereotype of like that just deconstruction only. And while deconstruction is important, it's sort of like a fixation, and it plays into that that myth that socialism and the left and communism is destructive. And it's sort of a fixation on like the tearing down aspect and the destruction aspect. And the reason why I say deconstruction is important is because, yes, it is true that, the social norms and all of the things that come along with capitalism do need to be deconstructed, but that's only part of it. And that's the lesser important part. The most important part is the socialist construction, the building up of the country, the development of the country that would happen under socialism. And that aspect, the constructive aspect, the positive aspect, which is truly the heart of what socialism is about, is downplayed or not discussed at all within the synthetic left, the ultra left, liberal left. That's not talked about, that's ignored, and that's probably deliberately so, as we'll get into a little bit later within the synthetic left, its origins, and who sort of had interest in promoting the synthetic left. It's a very destructive, counterproductive view and definition of socialism and leftism that really plays into the hands of the right wing, the anti-socialist, anti-communist forces. So that's the first aspect, emphasizing that socialism is to the benefit of the vast majority of the people of this country, the working class, the poor, impoverished masses of this country. That's one. And I think that's the most important aspect that I think should be sort of the basis of all other aspects. And then some of the other aspects that come along with it is sort of the aesthetics of it, which has gotten a lot of the controversy around it. Of course, a lot of the ultra leftist, synthetic leftists attack the idea of patriotic socialism or American socialism, proletarian patriotism, because most of us advocate for using, aesthetics of the American flag, mixing, the American flag with socialist aesthetics and stuff. And I'm in favor of that. I think that that's positive. It's a way of emphasizing that socialism is not some foreign concept. It's a concept for all countries, all nations, all peoples. And we have a strong history of socialism and communism in this country, going back for a long period of time, as has been pointed out by a lot, going back as far as to the this would be surprising to a lot of people, but the Pledge of Allegiance in fact, was written by a self-described socialist, described himself as a Christian socialist, and had his own ideas and stuff, but nonetheless used the term socialist to describe himself. And then, this during the Civil War, all of the there were communist generals within the Union Army. There was a division within the Union Army that flew the red flag, made up of communist volunteers. And then, of course, all the activism with the Communist Party USA throughout the 30s and throughout the Cold War and the civil rights struggle and all that. There's a strong history of communists, socialist revolutionaries within the history of the United States who consider themselves to be patriots, fought against any form of national chauvinism, racism, under the idea of uniting the working class, multiracial working class. And so there's certainly a basis for using the American flag and mixing socialist and communist aesthetics with the American flag. But that's, and I'm in favor of that. I think we should use that. And I think that's a winning strategy. And there's, not only is it practical, but it's also ideologically and politically correct to do so as a communist or socialist. But say you don't agree with that aspect. And that's where a lot of the synthetic leftists attack patriotic socialism from, and American socialism, because of the use of the American flag. They say, oh, how can you use this symbol of genocide for socialism? This is, they'll go so as far as to say it's white supremacist. You're a white supremacist if you use that flag. This is national chauvinism and so on. And I think that's wrong. But okay, even if you take that position, you could still agree with the previous position of patriotic socialism, which is that socialism is to the benefit of the American people. And when I say the American people, I just mean the population of the United States overall, the working class of this country. It's to the benefit. So say you don't agree per se with the use of the American flag. I know that there's a lot of leftists, some anti-imperialist, legitimate leftists who have criticism and concerns over that. Say you don't agree with that. You could still agree with the broader message of proletarian patriotism, American socialism, patriotic socialism. And so I think there's two aspects. There's really the heart of it, what it's about. The idea that socialism is to the benefit of the working class of this country. And then there's the aesthetics of it. And I think both are correct. But say, for example, you don't agree with the aesthetics of it, you could agree with the overall message of it,
Right, and a lot of people don't think, and like that these people, the detractors, like don't think there's a connection between patriotism and socialism at all in general. They also like to claim that, like, they actually do they have their own version of American exceptionalism. Like American workers are not allowed to be patriotic and love their country because of settler colonialism, like as if settler colonialism was only an American it only happened in the United States, but actually it happened all over the globe. But
Right.
these people, like in other like countries, like for example in Cuba, in Latin America, they really do utilize patriotism. The Soviet Union, China, the DPRK, these countries, they all use patriotism in order to unite the masses against their common enemy, which are the imperialists. So like why wouldn't we be able to use that same tool? It's patriotism is a tool to unite the masses because we're meeting people where they're at, and people love their country. People love the people in their country, and they want everyone to do well and prosper. They don't want to see their country destroyed. They want it to be built up. So that's what socialism is about. Socialism is an economic system where the means of production and the centers of economic power are planned rationally, and this would raise living standards for the people of that country, of this country.
Absolutely.
That's how we would have like a jobs guarantee, rebuilding infrastructure, having guaranteed housing, education, and jobs for all, with a system like that, that would benefit the majority of Americans. And that would also, having socialism in America would also benefit the international community because it's all about win-win cooperation. This is also what being a patriot is about, fighting for and loving the people of your country, which means wanting to increase the living standards of your country while also simultaneously working with other countries to make that happen. So patriotism is the opposite of nationalism. You kind of touched on this as well, but like nationalism is basically that's chauvinism. It's thinking your country is more superior, and your loyalty to your country comes at the expense of other countries. So this is why patriotism and socialism are interlinked. Socialism is about ending imperialism, which only benefits the monopolist bankers, Wall Street, and the military-industrial complex. And it's about enacting a system that will raise people's living standards, because only imperialism benefits the banker elite, who are the ones who are waging wars across the globe, and at the same time who are crushing the American working class. They're crushing their living standards. They're destroying the country. They're the reason why we don't have infrastructure. They're the reason why we have poisoned water and food. And that's why 40% of the homeless population have jobs, and people are poverty is increasing here. The opioid crisis is increasing all the time, and that's why we have more prisons, and a low wage police state is emerging here. It's been going on for a long time, and that benefits the imperialists. It doesn't benefit the workers. The workers aren't the ones that benefit from imperialism. It's the monopolist bankers and the imperialist class. And the synthetic left, are the ones that are going around doing the dirty work for the imperialists, going around saying that they want to destroy America, and that the living standards that people have in America are too good. People need to suffer more and have less. That only benefits the imperialists. So that's why they are, if you're acting on behalf of the imperialists, you are essentially an imperialist yourself. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times, like the way the media talks about the hardships faced by the working class and the poor of this country is that, it was all caused by COVID, and that before COVID everything was fine. It was just COVID that did this. Everything was fine. It was this bizarre thing. It has nothing to do with capitalism. It has nothing to do with the system. It was just this thing that no one could have predicted. Everything was fine before then. Now things are really bad, but it's COVID's fault, and that's not the system's fault. That's not anyone's fault, really. Just this thing that came out of nowhere, no one expected. But that's complete nonsense, because people, if you think back, you'll probably remember that the Federal Reserve actually put out a report in I believe it was released in 2018, but it was done during 2017, well before the pandemic, that said that 40% of American adults cannot afford a $400 emergency. That's huge. And that was before COVID. This is 2017, 2018.
Yeah.
That situation has only gotten much worse with the pandemic. So the situation faced by the working class, the poor of this country, is extremely dire. And this idea that a lot of frankly childish third worldists say that, oh, the American public, the American working class are there's no revolutionary potential, they don't suffer. And then some of them will come back and say, oh, I don't say all of them don't. Oh, but yeah, we know it's some of them will try and nitpick here and there, but it's clear what the third worldist position is, that even now, the American public is not suffering enough for them. They're not pure enough in their eyes. So that's why they say that, the American public is the working class of this country, the poor are privileged. And again, some of them will try and nitpick and say, oh, no, I don't say that, but it's pretty clear. What are you saying then? You're trying to, some of them will say, oh, it's just the lumpen proletariat have revolutionary potential. So what percentage of the population are you saying? They really nitpick, and they really are saying, some of them will try to disguise it and say, oh, I never said that. But in reality, they basically say that all of the suffering faced by the American public, the poor, the working class of this country, is insignificant. And while it's true that historically, and to a certain extent still, but more so historically, the working class did benefit from imperialism, especially in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s. There is some truth in that,
Right, but
class.
It was a small portion that did, but the same people that we're referring to make it out seem that all the workers did, but there was just a small percentage of the labor aristocracy that that wasn't the majority of Americans.
And we've been in extreme neoliberalism for decades. That section of the population has been under attack and shriveled tremendously. That's why we see these statistics. 40% of the American public cannot afford a $400 emergency. All of the
80% work paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, and all of this this is pre-pandemic. All of this has gotten way worse.
And let's we can keep going. Like the number one cause of debt, or a bankruptcy actually, is medical debt.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the working class of this country absolutely does have interest in socialism. It is to the benefit of the working class of this country to have socialism. And this idea that the third worldists come up with, which is that it's not in their interest to do revolution, quote unquote, as our favorite third worldist likes to say, it's not in their interest to do revolution. And then he'll go on to say, and this really shows his mindset. This particular, I call him our favorite third worldist. It really shows his mindset. He likes to say, well, if it's in their interest, go up to some worker, some construction worker, give him a gun and say, do revolution. That's the mindset. Like that's what socialism is about. That's what revolution is about.
It's not about being violent though, and that's what this person doesn't understand. Like they think that revolution is about violence. And
absolutely. It's this childish view of romanticization of violence. And not realizing that, yes, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, pretty much all these revolutions have been, armed revolutions. But these were not revolutions carried out by people who said, oh, let's all just get guns and have a revolution for the sake of it. Let's just give a gun to some random person and tell them to do revolution. No, these were all acts of self-defense. And every revolution, Chinese Revolution included, Russian Revolution included, Cuban Revolution included, all these revolutions were attempted peacefully. They attempted to have a peaceful revolution, and they were attacked, and the armed struggle carried out by Mao Zedong, the Bolsheviks, Fidel Castro, they were self-defense. And I'll even include Cuba in that. Some people say, oh, how is that self-defense? Well, previously they had tried peaceful revolution before the Cuban Revolution that finally succeeded. Prior to that, they were trying peaceful revolution. So that sort of shows their mindset. But going back to the idea of patriotism, some of them will say, well, there's a difference between patriotism and nationalism of the third world and patriotism and nationalism of the first world. And yes, certainly nationalism, there's a difference. Nationalism of the United States is reactionary. Nationalism of the imperialist countries is reactionary. But patriotism, as you were talking about, is very different. And if you look at the one Western country that went socialist, the one former Western imperialist country that did go socialist was East Germany. And, you know, going to that idea of like, oh, they wouldn't be patriots and whatnot. No, the East Germany, even though it was a former imperialist, Western imperialist power, and even worse than that, it was previously, just before the democratic, the GDR, Democratic Republic of Germany, just before that, it was a horrendous fascist Nazi state. But despite that, the East German government was very patriotic. And some people say, oh, well, how is it patriotic? Look at the East German military, for example. The East German military preserved, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, or that we would do this in the United States. I'm just using this as an example to show how far of an extent they were patriotic. The East German military preserved many of the Prussian military traditions of Germany, in many cases more so than West Germany did. And West Germany, let's remember, was made up of many of the former Nazis. East Germany was the anti-Nazi Germany. West Germany was the one that was infested with former Nazis and infested with Nazis. And despite that, East Germany continued many of these Prussian military traditions, including the uniforms, the marches, even some of the music. They would perform a famous Prussian military march called, I believe it was Prussian Glory, which was, you know, used by all of the German militaries up to that point. Nonetheless, they continued that. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I'm just showing this as an example of how far they went with the German patriotism. And that didn't stop them from being completely internationalist, completely anti-imperialist, completely opposed to the Nazis and such. Some people try to say that East Germany was somehow some weirdos like to say that East Germany continued like the Nazi tradition, which is complete nonsense. They executed the Nazis, they got rid of the Nazis, much more so than West Germany. West Germany is where all the Nazis tried to flee to after the war, and there's a reason for that, because the United States utilized these former Nazis because they were anti-communist, anti-Soviet. And so East Germany is a perfect example of that, how they were strongly internationalist, strongly opposed to all of the previous imperialist and fascist states that were in Germany prior. And they were patriotic Germans, patriotic communist Germans. They promoted proletarian patriotism, patriotic socialism, and they were completely internationalist all over the world. They supported anti-imperialist forces, strongly anti-Zionist, supporting the Palestinians, and all of that. And again, that's East Germany. That's not a former colony. That's a former colonizing power. Germany, that's a Western imperial power. Another example that was an imperial power that utilized patriotic socialism. It's not to the same extent as the case of Germany, because it's not a Western power, but Russia. Let's remember, Russia was an imperial power prior to the Russian Revolution. It was not a Western imperial power. You could say sort of similar to Japan in the sense it was one of the few non-Western imperialist powers. But nonetheless, the Soviets and the Bolsheviks even utilized aspects of Russian patriotism. And some people say, "Oh, how can you say that the Bolsheviks utilized Russian patriotism?" I'll give you a perfect example. If you've ever seen the famous Bolshevik hat called the Budyonovka, which was the iconic hat, not the Russian fur hat, Ushanka hat, but the Budyonovka, which was used by the Bolsheviks. What that was based on, that was harkening back to old Russian military tradition and folklore, going back to the ancient or the old medieval helmets that the Russian soldiers wore. It had sort of like a dome with a point at the top, and that was also associated with Russian folklore, with these mythical Russian warriors and folklore heroes called Bogatirs. I believe they were Bogatir. So the Bolsheviks utilized that, and that was an iconic symbol that they used, and that was clearly harkening back to the Russian military tradition and folklore within Russia. On top of that, Lenin is quoted as saying that we love our Russian language, we love our Russian culture, all of this, and this was truly, they truly did promote aspects of Russian patriotism, which is not the same thing as chauvinism. They were strongly opposed to Russian chauvinism. They believed in the self-determination of all of the former nations of the Tsarist Empire. And I think those are two very good examples of that that were former imperial powers that nonetheless utilized patriotism to promote socialism and anti-imperialism.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still, and when we make these connections, I just feel like for some reason, when you like lay this out so clearly, I don't understand why it's a hard concept to also apply to the United States. Like our conditions are kind of similar to like what all these former imperialist empires had. Like the population was, the mass majority of people were suffering under that system. There was mass poverty, there was no health care, there was homelessness, there was infrastructure was crumbling, illiteracy was rampant, just the overall health of the people was terrible. I'm just wondering why. I don't know why people can't also see how the American working class are suffering in the same way, and how that doesn't breed revolutionary potential among the proletariat in the United States. Even Che Guevara said that the people in the United States have, we're in the belly of the beast. So this is, we have the most like revolutionary potential here in America. Same with Lenin as well.
Yeah.
So it's just wild to think that none of that applies to the United States. Like we can't use patriotism, even though the majority of the working class in America identify as being patriotic. They love their country. And I think the majority of people are kind of just confused on who their enemies are, because they get fed the what our corporate media tells them who our enemies are, whether it be people outside of our borders, whether it be immigrants or like Russia or China or the DPRK or Cuba, or then that's not really who our enemies are. The enemies are the people who actually fund those media outlets. It's the people
Absolutely.
who are on Wall Street. It's the people the oil bankers. It's the military industrial complex, and it's the parties, the two political parties who control our government and our state, that work on behalf of those people, the imperialist class. So those are who our enemies are. They're right here in America. They're not outside of it.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's only by uniting the American proletariat along class lines and our interests can we get anywhere.
Yeah, and there's a false connection drawn, or a false there's a false connection drawn between the state, the government, and the ruling class of the United States with the American public. And it's kind of interesting that people who call themselves communists of any sort would do that, because that totally plays into the imperialist narrative, which is that the state of the United States, the ruling class, the government, represents the American people. They're completely playing into that. They say that we who promote patriotic socialism, we're saying, oh, we want you all to pledge allegiance to America, or to the American government, the American state. How in the hell did they come up with such a leap like that? They're deliberately, I think, confusing the situation, trying to say that by us talking about patriotic socialism, that we're somehow trying to get people to have allegiance to the U.S. government, which makes no sense whatsoever. Because if these people pay any attention to people that call themselves patriotic socialists, Caleb Maupin is a perfect example. Caleb Maupin has, for a very long period of time, been an activist, and anti-imperialism was not just some peripheral issue for him. Anti-imperialism is the central issue, I believe, that he focused on throughout his long period of activism. And now he's a journalist, but his long history of activism, going back well over, I don't know if it's 2 decades, but well over a decade and a half, anti-imperialism has been the central focus for him, opposing U.S. wars, opposing U.S. sanctions, opposing U.S. attempted coups and such around the world has been a central focus. And for me, that's the same thing. For you, that's the same thing. Opposing U.S. imperialism has been the central focus. So this idea that we are somehow lenient on the U.S. state or something, or that we somehow have some allegiance to the U.S. state, we are more anti-imperialist than most of these ultra-leftists who are attacking us, because they, most of the time, would say things, now not all of them, but most of them would say things like, oh, DPRK, Cuba, Venezuela, China, they're not socialist really, or they're not socialist enough, and we don't really support them. We are the staunchest anti-imperialists.
Yeah, and they repeat the State Department talking points about all these, all these lies that the State Department spews. So they also do the bidding of imperialism on that as well. And to challenge your government, especially when they're not representing the people, is a patriotic act. And
absolutely.
That's why anti-imperialism goes hand in hand with patriotism, because you are fighting against you're standing up to the enemies of the working class in America and abroad. You want to change the country. You want to save. It's all about saving your country from destruction, and that's what imperialism is about. It's a system. It's a global economic system of destruction, and that's how these oil bankers make profits, is by destroying other countries, imposing their own markets and systems on these countries, and taking all the resources and the profits and putting in their own pocket, and leaving everyone else poor, hungry, and miserable. And that's what imperialism is, essentially. And socialism is the opposite. It's about construction. It's about building up and making scientific progress, and benefiting the majority of people, not just a handful of people. It's about benefiting the global community, and your country. It's about increasing wealth. It's not about decreasing wealth among the people. It's about making people
Absolutely.
wealthier, not poorer. And that's what the opposite of the synthetic left is. They advocate for people to be poor, and they advocate for destruction. And so they're more in line with the imperialists, because that's exactly what the imperialists want, is destruction. And
Absolutely.
they want to limit human progress. They don't want it to continue, because if that were to continue, then they wouldn't be at the top anymore.
Yeah, and there's no. It's not just a coincidence that the two coincide between the synthetic left and the imperialists. There's a good reason for that.
Yeah, and I think we should. We do want to touch on that.
Yeah. Well, first, when we say the synthetic left, I think it's good to clarify. When I use the term, and I think when you use the term, we talk about people who are ostensibly left. They claim to be left, but when you look at what their actual message is and what they advocate for, it's actually really not left, especially from a Marxist perspective. It tends to not talk about class. It tends to focus on the culture wars issue. It's often race reductionist. Now, I like to use that term because they like to use the term class reductionist. Well, I'm sorry, but if you're a Marxist, class is the central issue. That's not to say other things aren't important, but class is the central issue. The system's called capitalism. It's not called maleism or heterosexualism
Right.
or it's called capitalism, imperialism. That's what the issue, the system is. And again, that's not to say that there aren't other issues. That's not to say that other issues are not important, but we have to be coming at this from the perspective of what the system actually is. It's the rule of the capitalist class, the billionaires, bankers, CEOs, and so on. And so the synthetic left are the people that ostensibly claim to be leftist, but when you look at what they actually advocate for, it's actually not really leftist. And so good examples of that could be, what's called BreadTube, Vouch, a lot of the supposed leftists who somehow always come around to supporting the Democrats every election, no matter how right wing of a choice the Democrats pick. They could have racist old Joe Biden as the pick, and they'll come around to voting for him, even though he's brags about his Biden crime bill, which targeted especially African Americans. And he bragged about how it increased the death penalty to new offenses now would have the death penalty. This is his record, Biden's horrible racist record. They call Trump racist. Well, very well so. But I mean, Biden, all the more so. If you look at his actual record and what it's actually done to people of color in this country, it's been absolutely disastrous. So the synthetic left are people that they talk in a left-wing language ostensibly, but they distract from what the actual system is, and they come around usually to supporting the system, which if you're on the left, you're supposed to be opposed to. And the history of that goes back further than this, but in the context of the United States, the most important thing to know about is something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Right.
And this is not some crazy conspiracy theory. This is documented. This is on the Central Intelligence Agency's website. In fact, they're proud of this. They brag about this. In fact, they are proud that it's one of their most successful efforts throughout the Cold War. Central Intelligence Agency set up the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an organization to try and promote a form of supposed leftism that was anti-Soviet and anti-communist. So the idea being that you could be a quote unquote leftist who is interested in feminism, LGBT issues, racial issues, but be opposed to the Soviet Union and opposed to communism and opposed to the various national liberation movements throughout the world, throughout the third world, throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America. So the idea being that you can ostensibly claim to be a leftist on these various issues, but actually end up supporting imperialism, which is actually opposed to these things that you claim to be for. If you're against racism, but you're opposed, if you claim to be opposed to racism, but you're anti-Soviet, anti-communist, how anti-racist are you when the Soviet Union is the force throughout the world promoting anti-racism, promoting national liberation throughout Africa, supporting the civil rights movement in this country? And the Communist Party was one of the earliest, strongest supporters, fighters for civil rights for African Americans in this country. And this is hidden, deliberately so.
Yeah, it wasn't the Democratic Party, that's for sure.
That's right. Look at what the Democratic Party was before, you know.
Exactly.
And so communists and the Soviet Union were on the forefront of fighting for Black liberation, third world liberation generally. And activists, leaders, civil rights leaders at the time, Black leaders at the time knew this. So many, you know, W.B. Du Bois, for example, was a communist, pro-Soviet, pro-China. Paul Robeson was a communist, pro-Soviet, pro-China. Langston Hughes, I believe, was pro-Soviet. And many others. Many leaders of the Communist Party, CPUSA, were African Americans and fighting for civil rights. And of course, famously, the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, it's funny, now Hollywood and the mainstream media likes to use the image of the Black Panthers, but never talk about what the Black Panthers actually stood for. The Black Panthers were fighting for Black liberation, and they were communists. They were Marxist-Leninists. Anyone who was alive during that time knows very well that they were famous for waving and most importantly, not just waving, but importantly, reading and understanding Mao Zedong's Red Book, because they understood that the liberation of Black people within the United States was part of a broader anti-imperialist struggle throughout the world. And so going back to the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the US government understood that there was a major threat of African Americans and the public in general, working class, seeing the Soviet Union as a champion for them, because the Soviet Union was a champion for Black liberation and the American working class. Many huge numbers of African Americans actually went over to the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution to study for free. Yeah. And I mentioned many people who are African American communists and political people, but loads of just regular, ordinary people who aren't even necessarily political African Americans just went over and studied for free in the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of there's a population of African Americans in Russia to this day who are Russians, but their ancestors were African Americans who traveled there and decided to live there. So the Soviet Union was a big supporter of Black liberation, and the US government, in the context of the Cold War, was terrified of this and understood that it was on the losing side and that it had to readjust its message if it were going to win the Cold War. You know, when you're associated with racism, colonialism, when most of the world is, you know, colonized, former colonized powers, you're not going to have a lot of support throughout the world. So they tried to come up with rebranding and tried to come up with a leftism which was disconnected from the world anti-imperialist movement, the world communist movement. And that's what this Congress for Cultural Freedom was all about. And many foundations that are considered lefty foundations are connected with that. And, you know, the big money that funds a lot of what's called leftism is connected to this. So many foundations are connected to the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and this is well documented. Yeah. And the whole purpose for this was to promote a form of supposed leftism that had the claim to be leftist, but in reality supported the intentions and the goals of U.S. imperialism, which was anything but, you know, U.S. imperialism, especially at that time period and still to this day, absolutely racist, absolutely, you know, all of these negative things that these synthetic leftists would claim to be against. U.S. imperialism was promoting all of these forces that claim to be against those things. but in reality, through their opposition to socialism and anti-imperialism around the world, ended up supporting those various social ills that they claim to be against.
Yeah, and that's how I think it's also all that's kind of led up to now this age of woke imperialism. It's the same kind of I guess you can say playbook, just updated for the 21st century, I guess. You know, it's
Yeah. The CIA just did a woke YouTube ad earlier this year. Well, did it get any more blatant than that? The CIA doing a woke, actually a bunch of, one was really got really big, but there were a bunch of woke YouTube ads that, or ads that the Central Intelligence Agency created earlier this year. Again, the organization that supported white supremacist South Africa, apartheid, Israel, all the colonial states, brutal dictatorships throughout the third world that oppressed third world people. This organization trying to frame itself as woke. It's really
it's wild because now if you criticize anyone who is not white, non-binary, or whatever, if you criticize any of them who are now in a position of a lot of power, especially within our government and the CIA, or they try to use their identity to it's to weaponize, it's to
absolutely
weaponize identity now. That's what this whole woke imperialism is about. It's about you can't criticize, because if you do, then you're a racist, or you're a sexist, or you just want the patriarchy back. Like it's all about like mansplaining. You're a mansplaining, patriarchal, racist. That's what you get back when you have a objective criticism about
absolutely
about certain people and about like how our system operates.
Yeah, and we saw it. I think a really great example of that was about a year ago with the whole force the vote thing with Jimmy Dore promoting the force the vote to try and get people health care in this country. And the response to that was to say, oh, he's a racist, he's a sexist, when what he's fighting for is to try and get people health care in this country. People who are suffering.
When AOC, like, when she ran, she said, we can get health care. We can
the exact same thing.
She said she was advocating for it, but then when she's in a position to actually get it for everyone, she doesn't. And Jimmy Dore was rightfully criticizing, well, you guys have the votes, like the squad, here's your time to shine. Why aren't you using your power? And
Jimmy Dore very effectively played old videos of AOC shortly before election and shortly after election, where she was saying the exact same things that Jimmy Dore was saying, which are the exact opposite of what she's saying now about all this stuff.
Which is a typical Democrat move. Like the Democrats will, like Joe Biden, for example, like he was talking on the campaign trail, was talking about, eventually he caught on to, I should talk about, relieving some student debt. He was talking about how he was going to do some debt relief. But
the $2,000 stimulus.
Like, the stimulus, all the checks. Vote Democrat, you're going to get all these checks. You're going to get like, $2,000 checks. What happens when they get elected? Nothing.
The $15 minimum wage, just the whole list. They make all these promises. Then once they get in,
But then when you criticize someone like AOC, you get her identity gets weaponized against you. You just don't like women. You don't like people of color. It's this nonsense.
Yeah. Funny enough, I actually met AOC back before she won the election in December 2017, very briefly. And it was very, very funny looking back. And I actually met with her, shook her hand, and had a very brief conversation with her. And it's really unfortunate because, when it comes to Democrats, politicians, it's expected. They say one thing, then when they get in, they don't mean it anymore, especially living through Obama, the situation with Obama, hope and change, all this stuff. It's expected. But with AOC, was really surprising at first because she really sounded like she was anti-establishment, really a socialist, really anti-imperialist. But to see what happened with Force the Vote last year, that really exposed it so much, because that was the perfect moment. You're not going to get a better moment than that
Right.
in the middle of a pandemic, when Pelosi is in a weak position like that, when you actually have an opening to use your power to pressure for something positive, progressive policy, and you don't do it. And not only do you not do it, but you try and kill the messenger. You try and attack the person, spreading the message. You're trying to attack Jimmy Dore. I'll try to get him censored, saying that, oh, this is violence. These words are violence against me. It really was kind of, as much as we've seen like countless examples of politicians saying one thing, then getting and doing the opposite with her. It's really surprising, because she really did seem like she was anti-establishment and socialist. It really was quite surprising.
And we could have Medicare right now, especially because we are in a pandemic. Joe Biden could, there's an act. The one, was it 1881A? Is that what it is?
I'm not sure, but I've seen there's so many things he could do at the stroke of a pen, executive order.
Yeah, is it under the Social Security Act, like where they can, is it under Social Security? There's an act where the president can immediately expand Medicare to everyone in a crisis.
Yeah, and he chooses not to.
And they choose not to. Because like we were saying at the beginning, the both parties serve a different class of people. They don't serve the majority. They don't serve the working class. They serve their donor class, which are the imperialist class and the other factions of the ruling elite. So that's why we need to operate outside of these two parties, build our own party, and the only way that we're going to get policy change that benefit the working class is if we change the class character of our government. We need a worker government, a government like what Caleb Moffman says, a government of action that fights for working families. That's the only way that we can really bring about change for the working class here.
Absolutely. Yeah, and tying it back to patriotic socialism, it's this whole thing, what we just laid out with the class, it's class is what it's about. And the interests of the vast majority of the American population, the working class, the poor of all races, nationalities, our interests are not the same as the interests of the ruling class. And what the synthetic left, the so-called third worldists and other ultra-leftists and synthetic leftists try to do is they're basically just spouting the capitalist and government propaganda, which is that the government of the United States represents the American people, and that the American people and the US government are on the same side. And it's hilarious because they claim to be they claim to be like the most radical anti-imperialists, but somehow they find themselves spouting the same propaganda that the imperialist government does. They say that, and this shows that they're actually not Marxists or communists at the end of the day, because they reject class. They reject the idea of class. They're saying that the working class of this country and the ruling class have the same interests, and that's nonsense. As we've just laid out all these things, the ruling class of this country has their own interests, which are completely at odds with the interests of the working class and the poor of this country.
Exactly. And I think that's a great place to leave it, Nick. I would like to thank you for joining me to have this discussion. But before we wrap up, let people know where they can find your work.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a great discussion. Hopefully this will create some more controversy with these synthetic leftists, and will answer to those false accusations that they make in the future. But they could find the Flame of Liberation on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And and you'll see absolutely that those of us that call ourselves patriotic socialists, anti-imperialism is not a side issue. It is a primary focus. And we are completely opposed to US imperialism, and it isn't just some side issue. We patriotic socialists are the staunchest of anti-imperialists, in fact.
Absolutely. And again, thank you so much for coming on, and we will definitely have you on again soon.
Thank you.
All right, let me